A few months ago, I was staying in my partner's apartment for a few weeks by myself. I don't quite remember why I was out that late, but it was around 1 a.m., and I had just gotten off transit. Only one other guy got off with me, and he was rather tall and walked briskly. I was ahead of him at first, but he quickly passed me because even though I have a quick stride, I'm pretty short for a guy. I don't normally live in that city, so I'm not sure why, but the streets were incredibly empty. I remember thinking that because there wasn't even a single car on the road. We were literally a 5-minute walk away from a major university, so it was very odd not to see a single person or car. The only lights were the street lights. I've spent nights at my partner's place before, and I never remembered it being this dead. Anyway, I'd walked down the street and was coming up to an intersection where I had to turn left. I noticed this guy standing around in front of the bank that was on the corner. The guy ahead of me walked by him with no problem and went straight. I was a bit wary, but I didn't think much of him until I was about maybe a meter away, and he had sidestepped to be in front of me and held his arms wide open, grinning at me. I glanced in the direction of the guy who'd left the train with me, but he was across the street already. My heart was pounding at this point, and I think I may have started to dissociate from the stress because I can't remember what he looked like, even though I remember looking directly at him. If this sounds like an overreaction, I have a history of multiple cases of CSA by different people and have PTSD among other mental illnesses I struggle with. At the time, I was falling back into my disordered eating again and was also underweight. In addition to being short, so definitely not the person you'd expect to win a fight, and I knew it. I remember being frozen for a moment, and then on instinct, I very politely said, "No, thank you." I took a step to the right towards the street and tried to keep walking forward. He moved in front of me again, still with his arms wide open, expecting me to hug him, still grinning for some reason. I repeated my polite refusal and sidestepped him again. Instead of running the opposite direction, luckily, he let me pass, but I could hear him following me from a short distance. I was wondering what I could do in that moment, and I couldn't find him. There was no one around. If I tried to call someone, he was close enough to grab me, and I wasn't able to run very fast. Suddenly, I heard his steps speed up into a sprint, and before I could react, he slowed down again. I walked a bit faster. He repeated the same thing over and over. I wondered if I should go a different path so he doesn't know where I live. It wasn't the best idea since I didn't know the city very well, and he probably knew it better than I did. I decided I knew I could find help in the lobby, at least compared to if I went somewhere else. He sprinted at me again, and I turned around and loudly asked him, "Do you need help?" I remember not feeling my body and feeling lightheaded from the anxiety despite how panicked I felt. My voice came out clearly, and I sounded disdainful. I don't think I meant to sound like he was annoying and inconveniencing me, but that's how it came out. Then he spoke for the first time and responded, "No, do you need help?" I didn't say anything to that and just turned back around and kept a fast pace towards my partner's apartment building. He was still following, but now he was talking. I can't remember much of what he said. I was just focused on getting back without being assaulted. Eventually, I heard him stop walking. I know I'm scary. I don't know why he said that. I took the opportunity to put more distance between us and kept up my pace. He didn't keep following, though. He just kept saying, "I know I'm scary." He got louder and louder the further I got. I got to the door of the apartment building and looked back again. He was no longer in sight. I am not the door to the apartment building and then ran up the stairs instead of taking the elevator. When I got into the apartment, I went straight to the window because the unit had a large window facing the street. I wanted to see if I could see him. Nothing. The streets were empty. I texted my partner about my experience, but he was already asleep and wouldn't see it. Luckily, I haven't seen that man again, and I hope I never will. Okay, so a very weird experience my girlfriend and I had back in 04205 in rural Louisiana. We were hanging out at her parents' house on a summer night, watching movies. Nothing out of the ordinary. We were around 16 and 17 at the time, so when 12:30 to 1 a.m. rolled around, it was time for me to head home. I didn't have a vehicle at this point, so she usually dropped me off. Keep in mind this is a rural area in Louisiana, and we lived on complete opposite sides of town. At this time of night, there were hardly any cars on the road, and it was rather spooky driving through the wooded areas to get to my place, which was secluded, to say the least. We're about halfway to our destination, and in mid-conversation, she stops talking and asked me if I'd noticed the headlights that had been behind us for quite some time. I replied no, that I hadn't noticed, but assured her there was nothing to worry about. We continue our conversation, but now I'm really paying attention to the headlights behind us, and I notice they're getting closer. To get to my house, there were a lot of turns down roads that weren't main roads, and these lights were staying with us. At this point, panic starts to set in for both of us as we try to come up with a worst-case scenario plan. I thought of just pulling into the first driveway, but then thought, well, what if no one's home, and would they even help this time of night? Scratch that idea. I had an old flip phone at the time and decided the best course of action was to call my house flow and hope that my dad would answer. Between that point and us turning down my dead-end road, I probably called 8 to 10 times with no answer. With the headlights still following us at every turn, I told my girlfriend to just pull into my driveway and lay on the horn and do just that. The other vehicle pulls in right behind us. No one is coming out of my house, so she decides to cut across my front yard to try and get back to the road. I'm still calling as we go to turn around. The other car cuts us off, and that's when I get a look at the man. He's probably 50 to 60 years old, large-rimmed glasses, and smoking a cigarette. Our eyes meet, and he gave me the weirdest, creepiest grin, and that's when I made up my mind that I was going to have to get out and confront the man. Right as I was building up the courage to do so, my dad ran out the front door, and the man in the car sped away. Needless to say, we didn't get very much sleep that night. She stayed at my place, and we reported the incident with the best description we could give, but to no avail. A few years ago, during what was probably the darkest period in my life, I worked overnight at a local Walmart 6 days a week. I would spend 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. stocking anything from fishing lures to makeup. I've never been in a more depressing environment. Everyone was really pathetic and too caught up in their own depressing lives to care about anything or anyone else. This included the managers. Walmarts have a generally weird vibe to them anyway, but this was a 24-hour supercenter in rural West Virginia, so you can imagine the characters that would show up throughout the night. We had no security guards, and from what I have come to understand, a lot of the cameras haven't worked properly in a while. Being one of the few young female overnight stalkers, I encountered my fair share of unwanted advances. But the one who took the cake was the guy who would show up every time I went out for a smoke break, regardless of the time, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 6 a.m., it didn't matter. The guy would appear around the corner and try to strike up a conversation within seconds of me stepping outside. It didn't matter what entrance I used, and there were 3. At first, I assumed he worked there. Why else would anyone voluntarily lurk around a Walmart at all hours of the night? Pretty much everyone on that shift smoked during their 2 nightly 15-minute breaks, so it wasn't out of the question to think he was doing the same. Maybe the timing was just a coincidence, but no. I came to find out he didn't work there, even though he often wore a dark blue t-shirt just like an overnight employee. I stopped going outside alone and would only venture outside with one of my guy friends, particularly one I've been friends with since middle school. Even their presence didn't deter him, and it kind of became a store-wide joke. I was weirded out but not alarmed until he started getting a little more aggressive. He'd ask me if I was seeing anyone and would ask me out pretty much every chance he got. I was playing GTA 5 at the time, so I came up with a story about my scary long-distance boyfriend Trevor from North Carolina. Even then, he wasn't fazed. I was done feigning politeness and began ignoring him. One night, when my guy friend had called in sick, and the others were working on something on the opposite side of the store, I went outside with 2 older women in my area. After a few minutes, they went inside, and just as I was about to follow them, the Walmart creeper suddenly appeared and insisted on me going to his car with him to see something, taking my hand in his hands. It wasn't hard, but I was still pissed he touched me. I'm a generally angry person anyway, so I ripped my hand away and sprinted inside. I reported him to the head manager that night and found out he had a cousin who worked in the back unloading trucks. Apparently, he liked to hang out with his cousin at work. The cousin apologized profusely and said he talked to him, but the management was a whole other level of shitty and didn't even say anything to the creeper, let alone ban him from the premises. I ended up quitting specifically because of the horrible management. Although it was over an entirely different situation, I found out through a friend that the guy tried like hell to learn my name and where I lived. He was apparently asking around about me for weeks after I left before disappearing himself. I can't help but keep thinking about how those parking lot cameras haven't worked in such a long time, and if anyone cared enough to notice if I just disappeared on one of those long tiring work nights. When I was 16 years old, my best friend and I made the dumb decision to get matching tattoos from an older man who was doing tattoos illegally out of his home. He was well known in the area within our age group for giving cheap tattoos to minors. He'd recently gotten out of prison for giving minors tattoos and not practicing under state guidelines. Needless to say, I don't know what we were thinking, but hey, when you're a rebellious 16-year-old dumbass and have the chance to get a tattoo for $20, I guess any and all common sense flies right out the window. So we set up a time with him to go over and to get our tats. I don't remember the exact time we went over, but I remember it was already dark, so it must have been late evening. It was just the three of us alone in his house. I remember feeling very eerie being there. Something about him and the energy of the place felt very off, but being the dumb teen I chose to ignore those feelings and go through with it anyway. We were there for about 30 minutes, got our tattoos, and then laughed. Fast forward to a few months later, I see his picture and name on the news. At first I thought he got busted again for his illegal tattooing. Little did I know it was so much worse than that. He'd been arrested for one of the most heinous crimes someone could commit. Turns out he bought an old police car, a cop costume, handcuffs, and would go into the parts of Portland that prostitutes frequented, impersonating a cop to arrest them. He brought them back to his house and chained up the victims in his basement where they wouldn't be heard. There he repeatedly assaulted and tortured them. I was absolutely sick to my stomach when I found out. I cannot imagine what these women went through, and I still don't really want to know all the details. This was all happening around the same time we were at his house, so the chances that one of the victims were there or around the same time as we were could have been a possibility. I thank God that nothing happened to us, but there's also a part of me that feels guilt. What if someone was screaming for help while we were there and we just couldn't hear them? Why didn't he kidnap us? We could have been the perfect targets. Every time I look at the tattoo, it's a horrible reminder of what could have been. Saw him planning on getting it covered up. Thankfully, all of his victims are alive, and I hope and pray that they're able to recover from this horrible act. It will be in prison for a life, with no possibility of parole. Always trust your gut. I was originally told he was keeping his victims in his basement. Well, it turns out it was actually his garage. He had a whole setup and would record the acts. I was also told that there were multiple victims, but it looks like one has only ever been confirmed to have been taken back to his home. Who knows how many more victims there were. Sadly, the demographic of women he was targeting are less likely to come forward, and it turns out he didn't get a life sentence after all. Per Washington state's three-strike law, a third conviction of a violent or sexual felony means mandatory life in prison. This was his third offense. The guy was somehow able to get a plea deal and is only serving 30 years. I'm disgusted thinking he will be free again one day. One Saturday morning, I decided to go to my local Goodwill. I'm disabled and suffer from chronic pain. I use a cane on my good days and a wheelchair on bad days. Luckily for me, this was a good day. I parked out front and got out of my car and immediately noticed a man sitting at the far corner in front of the Goodwill. As I was walking into the Goodwill, he shouted, "Miss, do you have any extra time for me today?" I'd never seen this man in my life. It really did not want to engage with him, so I politely said, "No sir, not today, I'm sorry," and I continued walking. He shouted something else at me, but I couldn't make out what he said, and I was afraid if I had stopped and asked then he would try to engage me in a conversation. I ignored him and continued walking. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him begin to stand up. I walked faster and entered Goodwill. Thinking I was in the clear, I began walking along the storefront, just looking at the items. My heart dropped when I glanced through the front window and saw him walking briskly towards the entrance. I immediately thought he might be following me. This has happened to me before at Goodwills. Every time I've wound up in uncomfortable conversations where I have to continuously decline the advances of man I'm really not interested in. It's gotten to the point where I wear a fake ring when I go out so I can say I'm married, because sometimes they accept That answer better than me simply not being interested in that moment. The disability left my body because I picked up my cane and booked it to the nearby rack of ball gowns and hid behind them. Through the gaps, I observed him storming into the store and start to look through the aisles. I was scared because he looked angry. Maybe because I ignored him. I didn't mean to be rude, but I thought I'd made it clear in a polite way that I did not want to speak with him. I don't think it's wrong of me to want to go thrifting without having to engage with random men. A kind woman nearby came up to the ball gowns where I was hiding and pretended to inspect them. She whispered, "Are you okay?" I said, "I think the man in the blue is looking for me." She said she thought it was well, and I asked her if any of the nearby dressing rooms were open. She pointed to the one that was, and when I saw that the man had turned his back, I dived underneath the door and locked it behind me. I called my boyfriend from the dressing room in tears and asked him to come to the store. Soon I heard a knock at the door. The kind woman had gotten the manager. She told me that after the man looked through all the aisles, he walked out, grabbed his bag, and left the area. They closed the dressing room I was in and let me hide in it until my boyfriend arrived. Then one of the male employees and my boyfriend walked me to my car. That was the end of it. Nothing really dramatic happened, and since we were in public, I don't think my life was in danger, but it was an unsettling experience. I hate to think of the possible confrontation we might have had if he'd found me. I'm just so thankful to the Goodwill employees and the kind woman who helped me that day. Several years ago, I walked a handful of blocks up the street from my partner's house to a convenience store to buy something to drink. It was about 11 p.m. and I was trying to slide in there before the store closed. To set the scene, we lived in a transitory neighborhood that was chock full of abandoned houses and crime, with a few occupied residences and businesses scattered about. There were zero street lights or illumination. Envision a more compact version of the type of Detroit neighborhood exemplified in the movie Barbarian, and you won't be far off the mark looking back. The nighttime excursions to the store / from my place to his were absolutely idiotic on my part, but after living in that environment for years, you just become accustomed to it. Anyway, it was one of my many foolhardy nighttime storm trips. My partner, by then, would ask me not to do it, but I just ignored that. I wanted my drink. I got a few blocks up the street in the usual darkness, got my drink, and left the store to head back. Outside the store, a guy was standing near the trash can, hassling everyone who came out, asking for money, cigarettes, and that kind of thing. I told him I didn't have anything and started to cross the parking lot, head back, but this guy sprang after me like a rabbit and grabbed a hold of my arm. He starts aggressively demanding that I go to a party with him and trying to steer me down the pitch-black side street just beside the convenience store. I was probably 6'7", crazy tall and really thin, with dreads all in his face, making it hard to even see what he looked like. His fingers bit into my arm and felt like they pinched a nerve. My heart starts pounding like crazy right away. I was used to brushing off this type of behavior, having lived in that neighborhood for several years back then, but this was way more aggressive than anything I'd faced so far. I shook my arm out of his grasp, told him I was heading to my partner's place, and it was only a few blocks down the street. I said that he was waiting for me, and I said sorry in an attempt to placate him and took off speed walking down the street as fast as I could. He called after me several times, and then I heard his quick footsteps as he decided to follow me down the street. By then, I could feel my heartbeat in my eyes, my mouth had gone dry, and I was almost hyperventilating with fear, trying to stay quiet so he wouldn't hear me. I had this feeling that to show fear or to look back at him would cause him to react violently right away. So, I just put on a burst of speed and tried to outwalk him. My legs were no match for his crazy long stride, and I could hear little pieces of rock and concrete crunching under his feet as he closed in on me. I literally felt like my heart would leap out of my chest or explode from fear. I tried to walk faster, but I could hear the guy right behind me. I could hear his breath in my ear, and I got this overwhelming feeling that he was going to grab me at any second, maybe with a weapon, and try to force me to walk wherever he wanted me to. The neighborhood is pitch black, and there's no real through traffic, not at night. If he wanted to force me to go with him, I'd be powerless, save for trying to run from him. But with his height advantage, I knew he'd catch me fast. Then I could see my partner's driveway and him standing at the end of it, waiting for me. He had this terrible feeling and already worried constantly about me walking at night, so he'd come outside to wait for me. I saw that he had his crowbar in one hand. Then my nerve broke, and I started sprinting towards him. The tall guy behind me started to run after me. I reached the place where my partner stood and squeaked out help or something like that. I don't remember. I hid behind him and cowered, waiting for the tall guy to pull out a gun and shoot us both or start struggling with my boyfriend. It didn't happen. He gets right up in my boyfriend's face, standing way too close to him, and asks for a light. My boyfriend gives him one, holding the crowbar unlocked in the other hand so that it was very visible. And I grab a hold of him and yank him into the house, locking the door and absolutely losing it, sobbing and freaking out while trying to choke out what happened. My boyfriend goes looking from the windows and sees him kind of standing around and then leaving. He saw him here and there for months afterward, up at the store or walking up and down the street, unsurprisingly, I'm sure. Right? I never took another nighttime walk. I still sometimes have nightmares about it. This happened pretty much an hour ago. I was pulling up to my house with my mom when she says, "Who is at our house?" Me, being confused, looks at our yard, then I see someone walking up to us. My mom said he was trying to open the door and get in. Hey, I just lost my job. I was looking for somewhere to work. Could you help? The guy asks. I can't remember what my mom said, but it was basically no, because of what he's about to ask. Could you spare a couple of dollars? He asks. Sure, if you want to come to this side, I can give you a couple of bucks, my sass, thank you, he replied. My mom gives him some money. They then start to talk about how we should take it as a blessing and pass it to someone else. He says my mom is an angel. Then they start to talk about other things. I can't remember when the man disappears. My mom starts to drive around to find the man to make sure he's left, as she understandably doesn't feel safe getting out. We start to drive around. She calls her boyfriend and my dad. Then there's a cop car on the side of the road. Hey, there was a middle-aged man on my doorstep with a screen door open. Then he walked up to my car and asked for work this late at night, which I found suspicious. He asked for money, and I gave him some. My mom told the cop, "Where do you live?" The cop replied. My mom told him, and the cop said they'd follow. We drive back home with the cop following. He inspects the front and backyard, but there's no one. We decided it's safe to go back in. I talked to my mom about it, and she said he could have just been drunk and at the wrong house since it was St. Patrick's Day, and that people like to get drunk on that day. But I highly doubt that, as I find it weird that as soon as he saw us pulling up, he came to our car with a sob story. Take this information as you will, though this happened nearly 20 years ago, but I will never forget it for the rest of my life. I went to college in a very small town in northwestern Maryland. Our school sat in the foothills of the Catoctin Mountains, and my friends and I would drive around the mountains smoking weed. We got very comfortable on the roads and knew them very well. This story takes place before we knew the roads when we just got to school. Several of my girlfriends and I went out for a ride at night. The roads are winding and narrow. Some parts drop right off the side of the mountain. It was nighttime, so we were taking our time. We didn't see many cars when we would ride around, which was perfect. That night, however, as we pulled out of the parking lot, another car did as well. We didn't think much about it, as we thought it was another student. We enter the back roads, and the car is no longer behind us. As we go deeper into the mountains, a car comes up behind us. The car was very close to us, and we were getting freaked out. Mind you, we didn't know these roads yet, and they were backward roads, unpaved, and nowhere to turn around. I'm trying to drive as quickly as I can in order to get away from the car. All of us are freaking out, and we're convinced that this person is out here and is going to kill us. Finally, we see a chapel with a parking lot. We pull in, turn back to the road, and watch a red-haired man drive past us slowly and staring at us. We book it down the mountain, park our car, and call public safety to tell them what happened. A day later, we get an email from campus security telling us to look out for a man with red hair, glasses, and a beard. He had been trying to get into the campus doors and was following women around. Campus, this happened to me 3 nights ago, and I'm going crazy trying to figure it out. I just moved into a new apartment 1 month ago, and I'm still unpacking and settling in. I've been using my parents' address as my mailing address all of my life. 3 nights ago, my parents called me at 2 a.m., freaked out, and proceeded to tell me the story. Apparently, at 1 a.m., someone starts banging on their front door and repeatedly ringing their doorbell. My stepdad walks downstairs and opens the door, leaving the front glass door closed and locked. There was a man standing outside who looked to be in his 30s, with a black hoodie on, with a hood pulled up around his face. He didn't have any distinguishing facial features, facial hair, or tattoos. The only thing my stepdad said was that he looked to be Hispanic. Neither my stepdad nor my mother recognized the man. The man says, "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for Alice Fitzgerald." My stepdad plays dumb and says, "Who?" The man proceeded to state my full name again and says that my boyfriend is worried because I didn't come home that night. He claims to be a friend of my boyfriend and tells my stepdad that they are both out looking for me, worried because I didn't show up at home. I don't have a boyfriend. I live by myself with my 3 dogs and haven't been in a relationship in the past 5 to 6 months. Here's the weird part. My stepdad asked the guy what boyfriend he was talking about, and the man tells him the name of the boyfriend I had when I was in 10th grade nearly 20 years ago. My boyfriend in 10th grade has a very unique Italian name. I've never met anyone with the full name even close to his. He says my high school boyfriend's name a few more times to ensure my stepdad heard him and repeats that they are very worried about me and if my stepdad is sure I'm not inside. At this point, my stepdad is weirded out and closes and locks the door in his face. The man does not leave. He lingers in front of my parents' house for the next 10 minutes, smoking a cigarette and talking on the phone. Finally, my parents called the cops. About 5 minutes before the cops arrive, the man walks down to the dead end on their block and drives away in a silver car. My stepdad was unable to get the license plate. My parents file the police report, and nothing else happens. After I hear this story, I'm going nuts over the weirdest details. How would someone know who I dated nearly 20 years ago, and what would the motive be of making up a story that included the weird detail about my past? I have not had contact with the 10th grade boyfriend in over a decade. Yesterday, I decided to message him on Facebook to see if he has any insight. I tell him the whole story. He's just as confused as I am and claims to have no part in it. I'm at a loss. I'm also really freaked out that some strange man is going through that much trouble at 1 a.m. to look for me. Any insights or ideas would be greatly appreciated. No, nothing else weird has happened since then. I also want to add something here. First off, I'm not in any legal trouble and have no reason to think someone would be suing me. I mean, I guess it's in the realm of possibility that I am being sued by someone, but I really don't think that's it. I had an expired registration ticket that I did not show up to court for, but I believe I got a letter in the mail just asking me to pay a really large fee, so I don't think that's related. I did take out a personal loan about 1.5 years ago. It wasn't for anything too crazy, and I was really good with making payments on it until about 6 months ago when I had a medical issue. Currently, I'm really behind on payments, but to my knowledge, I've not defaulted on the loan yet. I called the loan company, and they claimed to have nothing to do with it. All of my family and friends also noted that the 1 a.m. factor kind of rules that out. Anyway, nothing else strange has happened at my parents'. I went there for the first time last night and kept a close eye out for anything. I didn't observe anything out of the norm, so this remains a mystery. I'll be sure to update if something else happens. Years ago, I moved from a very small town to a remote valley out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by national forest and not many neighbors. It was just what I had always wanted at that point in my life. I'd been a paramedic for about 4 or 5 years, and being an outdoorsy, civic-minded soul, I decided to volunteer my services with a local search and rescue organization. For being such a tiny, poorly funded organization, we were surprisingly busy. In the 9 years I was with them, we have at least one rescue every weekend, spring through fall. The source of the majority of these calls was the roughly 100 miles of poorly maintained fire trails that were very popular with dirt bike and quad riders. When they'd inevitably get lost or wreck and get injured, we'd head out, track them down, provide medical care, and fly them out on a helicopter or put them on a Stokes basket mounted to a junky-ass trailer thing we'd pull with the quad. About 2 weeks after joining, and zero training beyond what I'd learned as a Boy Scout and medic, I got my first call. A group of dirt bikers from the city had lost a member of their party. For some reason, they put their least experienced rider at the back of the group of a dozen or so riders and took off into the woods. When they returned to the trailhead 4 hours later, the inexperienced guy was missing. They set out again and looked for him for 4 or 5 hours. Then they gave up and called 911. The time interval from the initial 911 call until we had a squad assembled at the trailhead was pretty impressive, no more than 20 minutes. But we were already 8 or 9 hours behind the ball. We did a very quick briefing, distributed maps, divided into teams, then set off. They put me on a squad with the most experienced guy, and we headed out. The plan was for each 2 to 3 person team to take one of the longer trails that ring the place. Then, after searching those, we'd systematically work our way into the shorter maze-like trails that made up the interior. This was to be a hasty search, none of that grid search, just riding around looking for clues. I don't know what I had expected exactly, maybe a few dirt roads through the woods or something, but these trails were an absolute nightmare. They were extremely rugged, technical trails where you really had to know what the heck you were doing and where you were going, or you'd never make it out. GPS rarely worked due to the rugged terrain and tree cover, radios and cell phones were a shoot, and the maps didn't account for all the random trails riders would just sort of make. The only marked roads were fire breaks, and mileage-wise, those accounted for maybe 10% of the trails. Why this guy hadn't been partnered with someone or put in the front of the group is a mystery. 4 hours into this, I'm caked with mud, bleeding from being hit with branches, exhausted, and just done. We take a water break and hear broken radio traffic that sounds like a bike has been found, but no rider. It's only a couple of miles from us, so we head in that direction. When we get there, the bike is off to the side of the road along with the quads of the other teams, but we can see them a few hundred feet in the woods. We walk over and find them looking down at the missing person, who is very dead. Lips blue, skin dusky, arms spread out like a cross. On first glance, his eyes looked to be wide open and solid white, but when I examined them, I could see that his eyes were actually covered with fly eggs. The guy had been dead for a while. It didn't make much sense, though. His bike still had gas in it, he had water and food. And he was a healthy guy in his late 20s. Why was he dead? It looked like he'd simply laid his bike down and ran into the woods to die. Mission accomplished, I guess. We wrapped him in blankets, then put him on the Stokes and took him to the trailhead where a coroner was waiting. About a week later, I ran into the coroner and asked what the cause of death had been. The pathologist's determination was cardiac dysthymia, second to extreme anxiety. The guy literally died of fright, which up until that point, I had always assumed was Hollywood. I've always wondered what was going through his head. Was he just afraid of the woods or being lost? If so, why did he run blindly into the woods instead of continuing to follow the trail? There's a part of me that thinks he may have seen something out there. I've heard a lot of stories about weird things in these woods, and I've seen a few strange things myself, so it wouldn't surprise me. To start out, you need a little backstory to show how I got into this situation. When I got out of high school around 2003, finding a job was difficult. So I took whatever horrible jobs I could to get by. When I found a job cleaning fire and water damage full-time, I was excited to have steady income and start saving. But this quickly turned into a nightmare that I had to endure for almost 2 years. The company I worked for put me on my first job, which was a water damage claim where a basement flooded with sewage. So after a few days of work, we finished, and it was on to the next job. My boss then called me into his office the next morning and told me about a special crew that he was setting up and asked if I would be the crew leader, supervising 3 other guys that were just hired. I found this strange, as I'd only been working there for a total of around 3 days. But I figured my work ethic was already paying off, and I would get a raise. I only made $10 an hour to start. Not only did I not get the raise, but I got no training in a new position other than a work van with cleaning material and the phone numbers for the 3 guys that were also hired to do fire and water damage cleanup. The boss told me what tools were best to use and what cleaning products to use to sanitize, along with where everything was located in the van with hazmat suits and respirators. But he was vague about what kind of things I would clean up. He just said the situations were always different and I would get detailed instructions each job. He called my position CSC crew leader. The boss told me that I would never have to see the deceased, as the coroner would have the remains gone by the time my crew got there, and to use my logic to determine what needed to be removed from their homes and what could be cleaned. The first job I had in my new position, which the boss told me about when I got to the office, was cleaning up the remains of an elderly man or woman who died in their house and had been laying in their chair. When we arrived, the coroner had me come inside to show me a few things that were considered hazardous material and needed to be removed due to the risk of disease. I guess my boss knew people from the county coroner's office, and much of the work came from their recommendations. Not only was the deceased still in the house, but was fully visible to me and the other guy, and you could smell the rot through the mask, as the house had no AC, and this was mid-June. The coroner was backed up and waiting on additional people to show up to load the body, as it was falling apart. And I call the body it because I honestly couldn't tell if it was male or female, and I was trying not to look at it too long, as it was disturbing. The other 3 guys I worked with handled it well, but 2 got sick from the smell and had to go outside to puke. We all waited outside after the coroner showed us the chair, the fluids that leaked into the carpet, and the basement where the fluids went through the subfloor and puddled onto some boxes in the basement. The coroner supported a ride and took the deceased out, and me and the crew started working. After about 5 minutes, weird things started to happen. The first of which was when I began to disassemble the chair. I'd removed the back of the chair and was putting it into the special hazmat bags that I was given, and the base started to rock when I was about 10 feet away, putting the bag with the back of the chair by the front door. Nobody else was in the same room, as the other guys were in the basement dealing with moving boxes. I brushed it off and took apart the base of the chair as much as I could, and when I got into the bag, I got a chill down my spine and began feeling sick. I just figured it was the shock of what I was cleaning hitting me and pushed on, even though the chill was strange, as I was very hot in a full hazmat suit in June. Next was removing the carpet and assessing the floor to see if it would be able to be cleaned or if I had to remove a section of the floor. So I called the boss to ask him, and he told me just to pour the special cleaner on the area to soak into the floorboards, and it would be fine. So I got it out of the truck where he said it was and brought it inside. When I got inside, all 3 of the guys in the basement were scrambling to get out of it, tripping over each other. All 3 ran outside. When I asked them what was up, all 3 said that there was someone in the cluttered basement, and they assumed it was a homeless person or junkie. Detroit has many issues with these kinds of things. I listened at one of the open windows to the basement. It's kind of the first thing we did when we started working, open any window possible, prop the doors open. So maybe someone got inside then or possibly before we got there and was hiding. After listening for a few minutes and hearing nothing, me and another of the workers went inside, armed with a mag light and a piece of metal fence post, and we searched the basement. Nothing was down there, except for the footprint of the shoe covers we used. But when we started up the stairs, we heard a horrible hacking cough from somewhere in the basement. When we looked for it, there was nothing, but the corner of the basement had a bunch of dust stirred up, kinda like someone was moving things very recently. That weirded us out. We called the guys back in, and they got back to the boxes. But all of them kept feeling like they were being touched while throwing away material from the boxes that had gotten fluid on them. I went back to my upstairs job, but found that the cleaner that I put next to the floorboards was gone. I started getting frustrated, as it was the only jug I had of this cleaner, and I clearly remember it being set next to the area before the guys ran up the stairs and got my attention. I began to take out trash, figuring I would find it eventually, or the basement guys took it for the floor. And I found it on its side behind the bag that had the back of the chair. This is impossible. There were like 6 other bags in front of this one near the front door, and this was a gallon bottle of cleaner. Again, I got a chill, but this one was brought on by what sounded like a whisper that I could not make out the words to. I cleaned the floorboards and moved out trash. Job complete. That night, each member of my crew had a dream about an older man telling us that we're not welcome in his home, touching his belongings, and that we need to leave. In my dream, I was alone in his house. The old man cried and told me I was destroying his things, and he couldn't replace anything. He was trying to push me out of his house, but it was like I was ignoring him. Even when he would push me and scream at me, no reaction from me. He then threw my cleaner into the garbage pile I had made by the front door, exactly where I had found it. 2 of the 3 guys in my crew told me their dreams about an old man pushing them as they went through boxes of ruined pictures and other stuff that needed to be thrown out due to the risk of disease from his fluids. They also said it was like they had no control and were on autopilot. They said they were so sad but couldn't do anything. The thing that got me about the dreams of the other 2 guys was that they both said the man was getting so upset that he began violently coughing, and that the man kept grabbing their arms when they would touch his boxes or throw things into the trash. Neither of the guys were in the house when me and the other guy heard the coughing from the basement. The guy that went into the basement with me said he had a dream, but all he remembered was waking up sad, like he did something wrong, and then had a horrible coughing fit, which might just be a coincidence, but I connected it in my mind as relating to the other dreams. We all talked about it and came to the conclusion that we were all just having a reaction to a situation, and it was nothing more than our brains coping with what we had to do. I'm very into psychology, so I rationalized it the best I could, and we hoped for better assignments the next day. The next few jobs were not so bad, cleaning up blood at a home invasion, no casualty but a huge mess. Then there were a few other bloody crime scenes with casualties, but nothing notable happened. About 2 weeks into the job, we began to learn the tricks of the trade and split into 2 different groups that I was responsible for managing as the crew leader. So I would have to go to different sites if the other 2 guys had an issue or didn't know what to do. I thought I was getting used to the job, as well as the other guys, as we had no other experiences like the first job. But I was wrong. The next job involved the remains of a middle-aged man who had ended his life. The coroner had already removed the body, but it was a mess. The guy had shot himself with what I think was a large caliber handgun or shotgun, as the spray was everywhere in the basement and like a second living room. There were skull fragments launched into drywall, brain matter all over, and again, he was not found for a while, so the smell was horrible. The first step in cleaning this was using our backpack vacuum cleaner to suck up all the biomaterial. The coroner told us when we went in that he and his partner were extremely uneasy in the house, and it felt strange. We immediately started getting a claustrophobic, suffocating feeling when we went into the basement. To make matters worse, the family of the man had come over and were crying upstairs, but the vacuum noise helped cancel that out. While I was cleaning, the power to the lights went out, and it was completely pitch black. This was strange because my vacuum was still powered. My crewmate started screaming at this point, so I turned off my vacuum and climbed off my ladder. I thought maybe he touched a wire to the lights, but when my vacuum unit was turned off, he was screaming, and I could hear things being knocked over. I started fumbling around for my flashlight on my tool belt and yelled for my friend, asking what was going on. But all I got back was panicked screaming. Then I saw in the pitch black something darker that was moving in my direction, and I will admit I freaked out. I slipped trying to back up, still looking in my belt for the flashlight, and found it when my back hit the basement wall. I turned on the light and aimed it at the blackest shape I've ever seen. When the light turned on, I saw the shape of a man wearing a flannel shirt, a beard, and an expression like he was about to attack me. Then it was just gone. My crewmate was behind where the entity was sitting on the floor rocking with his hands on his head. When I approached, he picked up his flashlight off the ground and turned it on and ran upstairs and outside, and then he threw up. I followed behind him asking if he was okay and why was he screaming. I thought I just imagined the entity and the man because his screaming scared me. But he told me that he was scrubbing the wall and felt something pulling on something on his tool belt, and he thought it was me. But when he turned around, the lights went out, and he was engulfed by what he said was like dark smoke, and he immediately could not breathe and was struggling to move. He managed to polish the flashlight out, but it was knocked out of his hand like his wrist was grabbed with force. And he managed to scream. When he screamed, trinkets started falling off an entertainment center that was about 3 feet to his side, and the black smoke moved back. But he was close to passing out from exhaustion. He said he lost hearing, and he didn't know that any noise came out when he started screaming, and that the stuff falling off the shelves was landing on him, and that's why he was covering his head. He said it felt like a weight was lifted off of him when the dark smoke backed up, but he felt sick right away, and the light from my flashlight made the sick feeling increase. We took an early lunch where he just sat there pale as ever and didn't say much, other than he said he breathed in that smoke and didn't feel right. I got him some Gatorade, and his colors started to come back. I never told him I saw a man when I turned on my flashlight because we still needed to finish. I didn't want to put that in his head since he never mentioned seeing it. When we went back, the lights in the basement were on again. Half the things that fell from the shelves were back on the entertainment center, and the TV was on baseball. It was also a different smell in the room, similar to burnt hair. My worker stayed a half hour, got sick again, and went home for the day, leaving me alone to finish, which I didn't want to do, but I had to do as the other guys had their own job. After cleaning up everything with my vacuum, I began scrubbing the old blood, which is hard after it congeals, mix in brain matter, and it's like glue even with cleaner. While I was finishing up, I kept seeing the shape of a person always in the side of my vision. Each time I would smell that strange burnt hair scent, and a few times I also felt like a force was pulling at items on my belt. I'm not sure what items, as there were several things on my belt. When I finished the job, I went to use the bathroom upstairs, and in the hallway along the way, I heard muffled crying or moaning. I froze up and stayed still, thinking maybe a family member had come back. And when I panned around, there was nothing. But I saw a picture on the wall of a man with a beard wearing a flannel shirt, several other pictures in the hallway of other scenarios of the same man, different flannels with deer or fish or family. I'd not seen a picture of that man, as I'd not been anywhere else in the house with a bathroom, nor did I use the bathroom downstairs because pulling off the hazmat stuff is a pain. As I was securing the house, closing all windows, locking doors, and shutting down every light but the front porch light, I saw the front curtain move and again saw the darker than black form front window. The last experience I will share happened in mid-July in a very bad area in Detroit. There had been an incident where a guy supposedly tried to abduct a child. He was stopped by people in the neighborhood who beat the man very bad, and he escaped to his house where the neighborhood people quickly called the police and civilians surrounded the man's house to prevent escape. Police response time in this area is horrible, and the people were throwing rocks through the man's window and damaged his car. The man was hurt back by the mob and was hurt by a rock or glass and died in the home. From what the police officer told me, it was a misunderstanding, and the man picked up a girl that was injured riding her bike, and some kids that knew her told their parents that the man was trying to kidnap her. People overreacted, and the man was brutally beaten. The cleanup was pretty simple to do. We secured windows, cleaned up blood and bodily fluid. But as soon as I entered the house, I just felt a wave after wave of fear and sadness like I've never felt this before, and it hit in waves that made my legs weak. My working body who was there showed up late and didn't get the story from the cop like I did, but he experienced the same feelings I had the whole time we were there. We saw a form darting around corners like it was watching us then hiding. It was similar to like a small bit of fog or a mist. We also heard very slight cries for help coming from several areas in the house, and also what sounded like please stop and no a few times. The crowd came back and yelled at the house also, and when this was going on, the activity in the house increased. We could hear running footsteps go up the stairs and a door slam, and it sounded like the front door would open and close, but we never saw any of the doors move. The path of the footsteps sounded like they came from the front door through the living room to the bathroom to the stairs to the upstairs bungalow room. The part that really got me was I could feel the floor impacts that felt like vibrations of something past me when I was cleaning the areas, and each time I would be hit by one of those waves of fear and sadness. When we left the house, there were a few people on porches hanging out like usual during summer, and the people were still hostile and yelling random things. But directed as us as we loaded the van and took off hazmat suits. We ignored this, but before we loaded the material from the house into the van and locked the house, the front door slammed hard enough to sound like a gunshot, which scared me and my crew member along with the people on the front porch to the point where they went inside. The front door deadbolt was somehow locked, and we could not get it open. I think it was a very different key than the knob, so we ended up leaving several boards in the house that were left over from boarding a few of the windows. The feeling of relief when I left the house was like night and day. Inside, I was anxious, scared, paranoid, and just really down, which could be due to knowing the story. But when I got outside, it was like flipping a light switch. I immediately felt better, and me and the other guy and my crew were joking and laughing about dumb stuff and normal 19 and 20-year-old shenanigans. I have many of these stories written down in detail and a journal I started after the first 3 months of working at this job. I talked to the guys on the crew and got other strange stories from them too. I know that some of this could very well be formed by my subconscious mind to cope with traumatic situations, but some of it has no explanation. And when I hear other members of my crew tell me stories when they haven't been influenced by mine, that is a horse of a different color. The job got way worse when I started the journal after 3 months and several experiences with what I think was paranormal. Many situations that stressed my mental state to the point where my mask of sanity started to slip. In the end, I worked at this place for almost 2 years, and of my crew, all died. 2 took their own knives, and 1 from a drug overdose that could have been intentional, and we will never know. I just know that when these 3 guys my age around 19 and 20 started this job, all were normal, well-adjusted guys with no cares in the world other than girls, parties, and working. I watched each of them slowly drain their joys and passion for life, and I know this sounds bad, but each one that died was considerate enough to die in a clean way. Most likely so another person wouldn't have to see the horrible thing that we all saw so often. My name is Rick Martinez, and I'm a retired truck driver. This happened when I was like 30 years old, and I'm now 62. On the road, I see many strange things. I've told this story over and over. A lot of people don't believe me, but it starts off in Stockton, California, where I picked up a load of pipe. My destination was Salt Lake City, Utah. I was supposed to refuel in Barstow, California, at a truck stop, but lo and behold, they were out of fuel. So I told my supervisor, "Hey, I got like half a tank of fuel." He told me to continue and hit the first truck stop I see. So 100 miles into Nevada, I see nothing but a sparsely lit desert with a couple of towns when I noticed my gauge set was reading empty. I think to myself, that's not right. So I took the first exit I saw and pulled over. I told my supervisor, who was right behind me an hour away, that I was afraid to continue on and run the tanks dry. So he told me to sit still, and he would be buying an hour, and we could siphon some of the fuel from his tank into mine. So I sat there, and I noticed that it was a small town with sparse lighting. As I sat there, I couldn't run the engine, so I couldn't listen to the radio. I sat there in silence. I don't do drugs, and I didn't make this up, so listen carefully. As I'm sitting there, I notice a lot of undone construction, a trailer parked to my right completely dark, and a church after my left about a block away with its lights on. It's about 2 a.m., and I see this jackrabbit hopping around my truck. It hops around and just stares at me and keeps hopping around. So I'm getting hungry, and I notice what looks to be a convenience store another block away from the church. So I get out of the truck and decide to walk to the store. While I'm walking, I keep hearing this dog howling like it's in pain. As I'm passing the church, 2 of the doors are wide open, and I hear clapping like they're having a service. I look inside, and there's no one except for the skinny white old man reading from the Bible and talking about hell. I don't linger too long and continue on my way. I then hear clapping again, and that's about the time the dog starts to howl once more. I noticed there's a bunch of empty houses on this street that goes uphill. I'm still making my way towards what I think is a little mini-mart. All this time, the dog keeps howling. All the lights are on, and as I go inside, this little old lady with glasses is reading a book. There's hardly anything in this store, maybe a few cans of food, a couple of bags of chips, and only water in the refrigerators. This whole time, the lady didn't even pick her head up from the book. So I grab a water and get some chips. I'm hungry as hell, and there's nothing to eat. So I asked the old lady, "Is this all you have? Where is everybody at?" She told me everybody moved out, and new construction was supposed to begin like 6 months ago. She didn't say anything after that, so I paid her and walked out and started walking back towards the truck. The whole time, the dog is still howling. As I get closer towards the church, I looked up the street towards where I heard the howling from. I decided to go see for myself why the dog was howling. The houses on both sides of the street are boarded up and dark. I saw a house with the lights on, with about a 5-foot fence. When I looked over the fence, I was in shock. What I saw was a man in his underwear with a chain attached to his neck on all fours, howling. The hairs on my arms and neck stood up as I saw this. Another man burst through the back door and kicked the man on all fours, yelling at him to shut up. The man on all fours ran into a doghouse. I was in shock and turned and ran back down the hill to my truck. As I passed the church, both doors still wide open, but there were no lights on anymore, and I could still hear the clapping. Finally, I made it to my truck and called my supervisor. I reported what I saw and told him to hurry up and get here so I can leave. My supervisor asked what exit I was talking about, and I told him. He said, "Oh, I passed that," and he had to turn around and come back to get me. So I'm sitting there, and the rabbit is still hopping around my truck. It stopped and looked up at me as I was sitting in my truck. I'm not saying the rabbit said it, but this is what I heard: "Leave." I rolled up the window and waited for my supervisor, who showed up about 5 minutes after. I told my supervisor what happened, and he just laughed at me and told me that he's going to drug test me. I did not sleep on that whole trip to Utah until I got to Salt Lake City. Believe it or not, I swear this is what happened. When I was 19, my best friend was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. We knew her cancer was terminal, and she had a life expectancy of 5 years at most. Her and I would talk every now and then about passing on and how even though I was healthy, I could always go before her in a crash or some other way. We made a pact that no matter which one of us left first, we would come back to the other and let them know that there was more to life after death. She eventually passed away from her illness at 22 years old, leaving behind her husband and her 3-year-old son. She passed away on a Sunday at 8:20 a.m. I remember the call from her husband vividly. He asked me to bring her son to the hospital because she passed away. That day was a complete blur. I couldn't find myself to come to the reality that she was no longer with us, and it all felt unreal. We were allowed to be with her for a few hours in her hospital room before she was taken away, but while we were there with her, I don't know. I was in complete shock, and my mind just couldn't process it. I didn't cry. Leaving the hospital was so strange because, at the time, I had no children, and my life revolved around my work, my home, and her. She lived a few minutes from my job at the time, so I would always leave work very early to see her, whether she was at home or the hospital. I loved her so much I could never be away from her. So now knowing I had to go home and trying to process I would never see her again just threw my life for a spin. That night I couldn't sleep. I just kept trying to make sense of it all. In all honesty, I don't even remember the thoughts that were going through my head, but the feelings of loss and confusion were very prevalent in me. I couldn't sleep at all, but at around 3 in the morning, I felt the most beautiful and reassuring feeling I've ever felt. I felt what I can only describe as a warm hug take over me from head to toe, and I fell asleep that night. In my dream, I called her husband to let me know that she'd written me a letter. He then tells me it's funny because she left him a voicemail. He then asked me to read him the letter, so I read it to him. In this letter, she tells us how thankful she is that we were in her lives. She thanked us for taking care of her and loving her. She asks us to please watch over her son and that she's okay and no longer in pain. She also tells us that we will be okay. As I finish telling him about the letter, my mom comes into my room and wakes me up. She asks me for a pen and paper. I hand her a piece of paper I had, and she starts to write. When she finishes, she hands it to me, saying she didn't know why, but something told her to write this and give it to me. When I read the letter, it was word for word what my best friend told me in my dream, and she signed it with her father's last name. Now, my mom only knows her by her mother's last name. No one outside her close relatives and myself knew her father's last name, so I was very confused as to how she signed it with her father's last name. I asked why or how she wrote this. My mom didn't know, she just wrote. I explained to her about my dream, and she was as surprised as I was. I immediately called her husband and told him about the letter in my dream. He agreed they were all her words. My best friend came through with her promise. This made me a believer. I know there's more after death. Okay, so a few years ago, I lived in an apartment complex in San Antonio, Texas. I lived there for about 4 years with a couple of my best friends. So over the years, I would run in a neighborhood that was close to our apartment complex. I actually had a couple of weird things happen to me throughout the years running through there as well as at our complex. But this event was the most terrifying moment of my life and caused me to stop running in that neighborhood altogether until life finally found my friends and me moving to different cities. Over the years of running in that neighborhood, I became familiar with this one house and gave serious trap house vibes. It was very out of place for the neighborhood as there was an elementary school just up the street and the area is not a high crime area. It was a corner house that was at the first stop sign of my running path and housed a group of about 6 huge men, and they always had people coming and going. It sounded like they threw a never-ending party, and their property smelled strongly of weed. As a woman and an avid watcher of crime documentaries, and I'm constantly paranoid and observant of my surroundings, which is why I come to know that house so well. Throughout the years, I'd always managed to see them, but they never saw me. But the last year we lived there, that changed. Just so you all know, it was not dark at all during this event. The sun was out and shining brightly, and it was about 5:30 p.m. or so. So I'm at the start of my path, and I'm coming up to that first stop sign near the house. I look for them, their vehicle, and any potential traffic, and I see that they aren't home. But I continue on my run, which takes me further up past that house into another neighborhood where I would run around in a cul-de-sac a few times before running back down that path. I'd say about an hour and a half passed by, and then I decide to head home before the sun starts to set and it gets dark. As I'm running home and coming up to that house and the stop sign, I'm listening to music and running, and I see that I'll need to stop at that stop sign because of traffic. So I'm coming up to the stop sign, which puts the house to the right of me and the stop sign for the four-way intersection to the left of me. I credit what happened next to trusting my instincts, remaining observant, and being in band and softball. I was honestly really tired from my run, so I was kind of looking down at the ground rather than ahead, but I was utilizing my peripheral vision. So I take off to run across the street to the sidewalk that will take me to a fence on the side of my apartment complex. And I see that the vehicle that had been stopped at the stop sign perpendicular to me is the vehicle I know to belong to the house that was just on the right of me. Out of the corner of my eye, I see them turn, like if they're going down their street. When I think, that turn seemed too wide, like a U-turn, which is weird since their house is right there. I take all of 2 tired steps before I get the sinking gut feeling. I have never in my life felt this feeling before, but immediately I felt danger at my back, and everything in my body and mind told me to run for my life, so I did. With that feeling of fear in my stomach and danger at my back, I sprinted down the sidewalk and slid under the fence like I was sliding to home plate. I immediately popped up and turned around to look outside the fence where I'd just been, and I saw them. The group of men that I'd only ever seen in passing were sitting in their car on the street outside of my apartment complex fence, with their windows down and all 6 of them staring at me. We stared at each other for what seemed like a long time before I watched them drive away, and once they were out of sight, I ran like hell to my apartment and locked myself in there, scared to show them exactly where my apartment was, as I was worried they were circling the complex looking for me. I told my friends what happened and spent the rest of the night full of adrenaline, pacing, and reflecting on what had happened. Those men purposely chose not to go home but pull a U-turn to follow behind me as I ran. Recounting the story over the years, I've had people tell me it was so they could view my ass as I ran, but when I remember that feeling in my body, I would almost hear a voice in my head yelling at me to run like my life depended on it, and think of their blank faces and dark eyes staring at me from inside that vehicle. I seriously question what their true intentions were that day. I used to live in an old Victorian house in Maryland, and at the time of this story, I was 10 years old. The house had been turned into a duplex that split the 2 floors, and they were basically just rented as apartments. I lived in the upstairs. There was a university nearby, so we had a lot of college students, and we also had a lot of drug issues in the area. People were always getting their houses searched or getting into fights over it, and I don't remember much crime happening that was unrelated to drugs. The owner of the house had told my family that the people who had rented the upstairs previously had given him a lot of trouble, and he'd kicked them out. My family had just moved there for my dad's new job, and we didn't have a place to live yet, so we were thankful that their contract ended early so we could take their place. If there was anything else the owner told my parents, it was not shared with me. I was homeschooled online and an only child, so my parents would leave for the day to go to work while I stayed in the apartment and did my schoolwork alone. Maybe about a week after we moved in, there was this loud banging on the door. I ran down the inside stairs to open it, and there was this tall, thick man dressed in all black with a black mask over his whole face, with holes in it for his eyes and mouth. I was immensely stupid, as this sounds. No alarm bells went off to me. This place was called year-round, and I stupidly just assumed his gear happened to be black behind him. I remember seeing a car parked next to the building that was still running. He just stood there silently for a couple of seconds, and I felt awkward, so I said, "Hi, can I help you with something?" He continued to just stand there for what felt to me like forever before saying something like, "I'm here for the mail." I'm smiling and said something like, "Oh, sure." He must have just moved out. My dad already brought the mail in this morning. Let me go see if there's anything there. So I turned around, left the door wide open, and ran inside to find the mail pile. I looked through it, but I didn't see anything that didn't have my family's name on it, so I went back to the door. When I went back to tell him the bad news, he was gone, and so was the car. When they came home that evening, I told my parents that the previous renters had stopped by and asked for the mail. My dad had a fit and said I shouldn't have opened the door while I was home alone, and that apparently our mail comes from the owner since he separates it before bringing it to each renter's box, since we had the same address, so we wouldn't have gotten any mail that didn't belong to us anyway. And that the previous renters would already know that. He was furious with me for being naive, and that was before he thought to ask what they looked like. I described the all-black suit and mask. I know enough now to know that I handled the situation entirely wrong, and I'm beyond stupid, and I'm not looking to get berated for it, but I would actually like to hear why you think if this suspicious guy had malicious intentions, why didn't he do anything? I was home alone, it was morning, so my parents wouldn't have come back until the evening anyway. I don't even think the other renter was home. I clearly didn't suspect anything from him and left the door wide open while I turned my back to him and ran inside the house. I'm immensely thankful that nothing happened to me. I don't ever want to appear as ungrateful that this didn't take an awful turn. I just don't understand what protected me, if that is actually the case. I had a dive buddy go out of air on me on a wreck in the St. Lawrence. Thankfully, this was a no-deco dive in under 100 feet of water, and we weren't actually inside the wreck, but the part that made it particularly challenging was that the wreck was right in the middle of the shipping lane with a really high current. So we couldn't just make an easy ascent to the surface. We had to navigate along a series of lines that had been laid out to give divers something to hang on to, so they could pull themselves against the current on the path to the wreck and destabilize themselves during the swim back to the anchor line. We were making our exit, and everything was going fine. He was on my 7-foot hose out in front, and I had a hand on his knee, so we were keeping in good contact. Then, for one moment, I let go of his knee to deal with some gear. In that split second, he came off the line and got caught in the current, ripping my regulator out of his mouth in the process. I saw him manage to grab hold of another of the lines downstream, and he was hanging on for dear life, completely inverted in a shipping lane with no regulator in his mouth and no gas in his tank, flapping in the current like a flag in the wind. I bolted towards him as quickly as I could while still maintaining my safety and gathered up the 7 feet of abandoned hose and regulator along the way. I caught up to him and managed to get the regulator back into his mouth, but since he was inverted, it went upside down, and as a result, didn't breathe like it should. He fixed it himself, but slipped off the line he was holding onto in the process. I managed to get a hold of him, but not without having to let go of the line myself, so I ended up hugging both of my feet around the line to keep us both in place. Somehow, I managed to pull us both back down to where we could grab hold of the line. It was at this point that another diver in our group saw what was going on and assisted, and from there, we were able to get back to the boat without any further incident. Let me preface the story with a bit of background information. I'm a college student majoring in engineering. I'm currently away from school on a co-op rotation with a major company. My company is headquartered in a larger city, and I'm working at a smaller site just north of HQ. I live in a small township in the suburbs, the gated apartment complex. In a very nice area, I regularly go on jogs with my music on full blast and my dog at my side. We walk around at night. It's, by all accounts, a very safe place to live, and I felt very safe here until today. I woke up and got ready for work like normal. When I got in my car, not only was it basically frozen over, but I noticed I was low on gas. I decided not to risk it and fill up before work. Once my front and back windows defrosted just enough for me to see, I drove a block down the road to my usual fill-up spot. It has lots of pumps and usually isn't packed, and it's really close to my apartment. They also usually have lower prices than other gas stations in the area. I pull into the parking lot, and there isn't another car anywhere, save for a semi-truck parked by the doors and employee cars around the side. All the pumps are open. I pull up to the farthest right pump and hop out. As I'm swiping my card and doing all that fun stuff, another car pulls up. I didn't get a great look at it, honestly, but it wasn't shiny or new. I barely paid any attention until the car stopped at the pump on the other side of my own. You know how pumps are double-sided. Of all the open pumps this driver chose, the one connected to the one I was currently using. Not exactly perfect, pandemic matters still. I didn't think that much of it, at least not initially. I could hear the other drivers swiping their card and entering their PIN number. I was freezing cold and just trying to hurry. I turned around and put the nozzle in the car, and I stood there for a minute. Foolishly, I decided to keep my back turned. I didn't want to have contact with that person, so I tried to pretend nobody was there. Once I filled up, I removed the nozzle and turned around, still keeping to myself and not lifting my eyes. I finished the transaction and got my receipt. While it was printing, I looked up casually. I almost fell flat on the pavement when I saw a man peering around the corner of the pump, staring at me. You know how people sometimes describe creepy people as having an inhumane quality? I never really understood that until today. The way this man looked at me sent a shiver down my spine. His eyes were cold and unyielding. He was not blinking or moving, but his gaze was growing even more intense. There was something animalistic in the way he stared at me. I felt like a deer being watched by a mountain lion. The hairs on the back of my neck stood. My instincts screamed at me to run. This all took place in the span of just a couple of seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. I quickly opened my car door. When I did, he moved his head, tilting it to the side to peer into my car, but I didn't consider it at the time. He might have been looking to see if I was alone. I intentionally blocked the view of the inside of my car with my body and closed the door quickly. I locked it immediately. I mentioned earlier that my car was nearly frozen over by now. The front and back windows were entirely clear. The side windows, however, were almost still. All I see there was a single strip of clarity in the driver's side window, a result of me rolling the window down a few moments prior in an attempt to clear it off. As I hastily buckled my seatbelt, I ventured a glance to my left. He was still there, still staring, but he'd inched closer. I could see more of his body than before. He was tall with dark hair and a well-built frame. He was certainly larger than me. He seemed a few years older than me. Had it not been for those eyes, I might have said he was attractive, but those eyes, they were haunting. And I decided to do the logical thing and get myself out of there as fast as possible. I didn't want to chance him being able to follow me, though my work has great security, and I didn't want him knowing where I worked. I don't know if this man was just a creep or something much darker, but I don't want to find out ever. In my early 20s, I landed a receptionist job in a sales office at a manufactured housing community. It was my first office job after working in daycare and the food and drink industry. I was so excited. I greeted potential buyers, set up appointments, and staged the spec homes with our stock of furniture and decorations. I worked with one other person in the office who was the salesman. When he was out of the office, I took potential buyers through our spec homes and gathered their information for the follow-up. I was working alone one day when a customer came into the office looking to potentially purchase his first home. I gathered some information from the young man and asked if he would like to look at some spec homes. As we walked down the sidewalk toward the row of spec homes, we chatted about the various floor plans and finishes available. I knew the product information and had no trouble confidently answering his questions. He was friendly and reminded me of a classmate from high school that had played offense on the football team. I decided to show him the two models that best fit his price range and desired floor plan. Since I shared most of the technical information during the first home tour, I gave him some space to freely look around the second home. He walked through the main living area and stopped in the doorway to one of the back bedrooms. He called out, "Hey, what is this back here?" and pointed to the corner of the room that I couldn't see from where I was standing. I knew these floor plans by heart, so I politely answered that it was a closet. He chuckled and asked again, "No, really, come here. What is this back here?" I could tell by his tone that he was pressuring me to come see for myself. He motioned for me to come closer and take a look. His tone was friendly, but his request didn't make sense. So I paused, and in that split second, something shifted. Maybe it was the energy in the air, the hairs on my neck standing straight up, or the way his eyes changed before me. I suddenly sensed the power dynamic had shifted. I did not feel safe. With all the lightheartedness I could muster, I repeated, "Oh, it's a closet. Excuse me for a moment. I need to check on something outside." I quickly made my exit back to the sidewalk outside of the house. I had no concrete reason, but why I felt the overwhelming need to leave the house immediately. I didn't understand why my body sensed danger. I just knew I needed to act quickly. Over the next few days, the young man came back to the office to meet with a salesman. He filled out all the various paperwork needed to purchase a home and live within the community. He dropped by several more times unannounced to check on his application status. If I wasn't there, he would ask the salesman when I worked next. My coworker thought I had a not-so-secret admirer. I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling something wasn't right. So, on the nights I worked alone, I locked the office door. A few days later, corporate sent back their analysis of the young man's application and completed background check. He had been denied. The background check revealed multiple sexual assault convictions. And there it was, crystal clear, undeniable. The salesman called the customer right away to let him know his application had been denied and that we could not do anything further for him. A few days, the young man decided to come back to the office one more time. When my coworker saw the young man's vehicle turn into our parking lot, he told me to go to the back room of the office where I would be out of sight. And just like the times before, the young man entered the office asking if I was working this time. He was met by a very angry 6-foot salesman that had nothing to lose. Needless to say, the young man never came by again, and I wasn't scheduled to work alone nearly as often. My husband and I like to go for walks after dinner. The neighborhood we live in is generally safe, even when walking around after dark, so we've never been guarded or felt afraid. One night during our walk at around 8:30 p.m., a woman coming towards us began arguing with the man she was walking with. It was a pretty heated argument, but something about it felt like they were putting on a show for us. The street we do our nightly walks on has a slight incline, so we could see them coming downhill towards us. I actually noticed her from a little over a block away because her outfit looked familiar to me. A few months before this happened, a woman wearing a pink fake fur jacket with one of her shoulders exposed and a tank top kept trying to jokingly take my husband's pizza box away from him when we were waiting to cross the street, saying, "Oh my God, thank you. I'm still everything." So when I saw this woman up the street coming towards us wearing a similar style of jacket, also with one of her shoulders exposed, the first thing I thought was, I wonder if it's the same one, and I tried to take our pizza. As soon as they reached us, they went from completely quiet to screaming at each other. It was like they hit their marks on stage, and someone yelled action, and they began their rehearsed fight. They were so loud, I could see people on the other side of the street looking over at them. So I thought, if they'd been arguing like this all along, we definitely would have heard them long before we saw them. The two of them also switched the direction they were walking. Originally, they were walking towards us, but as soon as they reached us and began arguing, they turned around and walked alongside us. They also boxed us in, the woman walking slightly in front of us to the left of my husband and the guy yelling at her from behind me to my right. I could tell my husband was freaked out too because he had a vice grip on my hand. "Get away from me, Josh," the woman screamed. "We broke up. God, leave me alone," she continued. "Why are you like this, always starting in public?" the man yelled. They kept pace with us. I tried walking faster to get away from them, but they sped up too. When we reached the intersection, even though we had the light, I pulled on my husband to stop for a bit just to see what would happen. They both did as well. They clearly weren't anticipating the stop because they actually continued walking a bit more and then suddenly stopped when they realized we were standing still. The funny thing is, as soon as we stopped, I saw a brief look of confusion flash over her face, and they stood at the corner for a few seconds, staring at each other, completely quiet, like they weren't sure what was going on, and then likely heard someone yell action and resumed yelling at each other. On top of all that, the man who was with her wore an outfit that was head to toe dark colors, like black and navy blue. The hoodie pulled down almost to his eyes and one of those combo neck face mask things pulled up past his nose. He was basically dressed like a ninja in 60-degree Fahrenheit weather. It was the pandemic times, but that outfit was overkill. He definitely looked like he was trying to hide his face. I did consider that maybe she was walking alongside us because she was genuinely scared. It was the reason I didn't just leave and pull my husband away with me. She'd call out to us every now and then and say, "You see what I put up with? He won't leave me alone." "Hey," I said after this happened a few times, "come with us to Fellows Avenue. There's a bunch of stores and restaurants that are still open, lots of people, so it'll be safer." She ignored me every time. Just when I decided that this had to be fake, she suddenly asked my husband to tell the masked man to leave her alone, and my husband told him, "Dude, I think you should back off and give her some space. Whatever's going on, you are not helping." And just like that, the creepy ninja guy left. He didn't put up a fight. He didn't tell my husband to mind his own business, nothing. He just yelled, "I want my stuff back, Jessica," and ran off. I found it strange he gave up so easily. The woman thanked my husband, but then begged us to walk her back home because she was scared he'd be waiting outside of her building. We immediately said no. Between where we were and the avenue she wanted us to walk along were a lot of small playgrounds, churches, schools, and parking lots of medical offices that were close by, like radiology centers. Basically, if we walked her home, we'd be passing by a lot of dark, unpopulated places where we could get jumped by Ninja Guy and his friends, and no one would be around to hear us scream. I suggested over and over to walk to Fellows Avenue instead, which would have us walking through well-populated residential neighborhoods, and we could wait in a store together while she called for a police officer to escort her to a friend's place. But she actually said, "Yeah, but it's in the opposite direction of where I live, and that's really inconvenient for me. I'd end up having to walk so much." Who picks convenience over not getting potentially kidnapped and killed? Also, if you knew your creepy psycho ninja boyfriend was going to be waiting for you outside your home to harass you, why would you go home instead of staying with a friend? She also kept telling us her address. "I just need you to walk with me to my building, number 1234, on Foresters Avenue, apartment 3B. It was like she was trying to reassure us that we really would be escorting her to a real place and that this definitely was not a plan to rob us or harvest our organs. But after several times of us offering to walk her to a restaurant or to a 24-hour drugstore, she finally said she was calling her mother to get her. Pulled out her cell phone and quickly walked away from us. "Hey, we'll wait here with you until your mom picks you up," my husband called out after her. She didn't answer, but I started running. We watched her until she turned a corner and disappeared. I know it sounds crazy, but even after that, I still wasn't completely convinced it was fake. I still felt guilty. Maybe she needed our help, and we let her down. Maybe she was following us because she felt safer around a couple. Maybe they didn't really break up, but I said maybe she just put us between her and her boyfriend so he couldn't grab her. After we arrived home and waited for a few days afterwards, my husband and I really struggled with whether we just left a poor woman alone to contend with an abusive stalker boyfriend. But the way she and the man she was arguing with acted suggested a scam more than someone trying to get away from an abusive partner. She was more concerned with convenience than safety. She wouldn't take our offer to accompany her down a safer, more populated path to a public place, and she didn't even want us to wait with her while she called her mother. Plus, the guy's outfit was really suspicious. It seemed like he wanted to be sure none of his features were visible. Pretty much all of my friends thought it was a scam too, but I still wondered. I still felt bad. Like a lot of people who post on the Creepy Encounters subreddit, I've been made to feel unsafe by creepy people in the past. So if I see someone in a similar situation, if I can, I want to help them get to safety. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember that not everyone who appears to be a victim actually is one. People may try to take advantage of your kindness and empathy to steal from you or, worse, be safe out there. About an hour ago, my manager and I were closing the shift at the store in my small town, north off the main road and across the rent-controlled apartments. I was waiting at the register as usual, watching people come in around 10 minutes before close, observing who came in so that I could make sure they all left. There was a guy that came in after a girl that I randomly hyper-focused on. He walked down the main aisle towards the bathrooms and went out of sight. I don't know why, but I wanted to make sure he left. Customer after customer came and went, the ones I saw come in. But 5 minutes to closing time, he never left. My manager went to the bathroom, and I stayed by the register until she came out and went to the office. I walked around the first few aisles in the front towards the door and didn't see him. My manager came out and wanted to buy some things right before we were supposed to close. I told her that I saw a guy come in but that I didn't see him leave. I felt really uncomfortable and disturbed, and I thought it was just because I'd been listening to the insanely creepy podcast, The Black Tapes. But after she checked the whole store, and then I went around and checked with her, we saw that he'd left a basket. We went into the office after I grabbed my staff, and we checked the cameras several times. We saw him come in, we watched the cameras again, forwards and backward, every camera outside and inside, right by the exit and incoming door. He never left. We decided to leave after about half an hour and called our general manager. I never saw him leave, the cameras never recorded him leaving. I'm absolutely terrified. I worked as a camp counselor for a few summers and had a great signature ghost story. I don't really remember too many of the details, but the gist was that there was some ghost who would kill you unless you gave him 2 of your teeth and told him 2 other names of people to kill. It was a fine story, but the real kicker came at the end of the night when all my baby teeth had been replaced with adult teeth. 2 of them never came in and were missing for a few years. I had a retainer with 2 fake teeth to fill in the gaps. Before sending the kids off to bed, I would pop the retainer out in secret and give them a big old toothy smile. They'd scare the bejesus out of the little buggers every time. We had a guy who was picking up women in the college town area I lived in and murdering them and dumping them down this road I would bike down to get to my ex-boyfriend's parents' house I'd visit occasionally. I was walking around the college town in broad daylight, and this guy in a beige-looking car pulled over and asked me if I wanted a ride. I kept walking and turned down my street to walk back to my house, and he pulled in and tried to cut me off with his car. Immediately, he hopped out and tried to grab me, and I started to run. It just so happened someone a little further down that street had gotten pulled over, and I started to scream for the police. He gets in his car and peels off. They caught the guy murdering women sometime later. It was that very same douchebag I almost lost when I saw it on TV. I was 15 and playing in a tennis tournament. It was a typical hot summer. Another player, who must have been in his 40s, was serving. He tossed the serve up in the air and then collapsed on the hard court. I rushed over to help and started CPR with his friend. We took turns until the ambulance came, which was about 15 minutes but seemed like hours. The EMT took over the CPR and tried to resuscitate him with injections and defibrillators to no avail. They pronounced him dead on the tennis court. I had to continue my match after they moved the body off the courts. My hands kept shaking, so I forfeited the match and sat under a nearby tree, just staring into space. His friend came back to find me near the courts to thank me. He told me about his friend, about his life and his family. Strangely, that made me feel better. I learned from that day how precious life is and how it can all change in an instant. I've been working for an independent hotel for just over 4 years now. We're the #1 rated hotel in our city and proud of it. I mostly work in housekeeping and have done some time at the front desk as well. I love my job and have always said that my bosses are great. Now, being a housekeeper, I've seen some things. I've seen a room where someone snuck in their dog, kitten, and chicken. We don't allow pets. I even had a room once that we had to call the cops on for a raid because we found meth. They found a lot of drugs and guns in that room. But today is the first time I've ever actually felt scared to be in a guest's room. As I'm working on a room that's already been vacated, a man in the next room overcatches me at my supply card. He's said to be staying for several days and tells me, "You can go ahead and clean my room now. I'm going down for breakfast." Excellent. I love getting my stayovers done early. It makes things easier for the people working laundry. So, I pop over into his room, opening it up and propping the door open with a stopper like we always do. The first thing I notice is that he has around 20 prescription bottles lined up on one of the 2 beds, along with insulin and needles. I'm nosy, I'll admit it, and I wanted to see what he was on. Oddly, it was only 2 different types of medication for all 20 bottles. About 2/3 were a diabetes medication, and the rest were a cholesterol medication. That's a little weird that he has so many bottles of the same medication, but whatever. I go to make the bed and see that some of the bedding has been stained. I sigh, knowing that I'll have to change all the bedding now, instead of just being able to turn down the sheets and blanket. So, I leave the room, closing the door behind me to get the linens I need, and then I head right back to the room. I prop the door open again and have to set the clean linens on the desk chair. When I see out of the corner of my eye 2 notes sitting on the TV armoire, it wouldn't mean anything, except I caught the word kill scrawled on it. I drop the linens and take a closer look. What I read on the first note made my blood run cold. It said, "It's sad. You don't have to forgive her, you just can't kill her. You were here to take money and alcohol away from you." Get over having to kill her, and you can safely leave. My heart was pounding. My eyes went to the second note, which just looked like a to-do list at first. But in the end, it made my stomach churn. The list said, spray and wash, apply for Medicare and subordination. The soul is healed by being with children, bank card follow-up, inheritance savings. Can we pop 10,500, Matt Montana? There will be a day of reckoning. Did you tell Mom what I said? How did Beth get my address? It was too much. I quickly snapped pictures of them on my phone so I could show my boss why I would not clean his room. I left the room quickly, closing it up behind me. As the door closes, I turn and see the man just 10 feet away from me, coming back to his room. My heart is in my throat, but I manage to smile and tell him, I need more supplies. I'll be back to your room in a bit. I take off straight for the elevator, having noticed our maintenance man waiting for the slow transport. In a hushed tone, I tell him what I found, and he sees that I'm shaking and that it's not a normal state for me. He writes down with me, and I go straight to my boss and tell her that for the first time in all these years, I am not comfortable being in a guest's room. I showed her the picture, and her face is still and pale. She goes to the front desk and asks our general manager for a minute of her time and then brings her into the office to show her. She agreed this was not a safe situation and took our maintenance man with her to go inform the man that he had 1 hour to gather his belongings and leave the hotel and that he was not welcome back. I spent a few minutes in the laundry room trying to calm down. Then my boss went back up with me to the floor until the man was officially out of our hotel. I don't know who Bev is. I don't know who the woman is that he didn't feel he needed to forgive, but man in room 422, let's never meet again. So I live in a town of about 60,000 people, and I've been living and working here for about a year and a half. I don't know many people here as I work all day and have schoolwork in my free time. Because of this, I've been trying to meet new people and found a Facebook group with women wanting to hang out. One was suggesting a pre-party before going out, and we were 6 girls in total. At around 3 a.m., 3 of us decided to go home. One took a taxi, and the other one lives like 3 minutes away from me, so we walked. We were talking and laughing for a few minutes before she went inside, and I started to walk home, rather happy and still a bit drunk. I suddenly noticed footsteps and got a bit paranoid. About 50 meters further ahead, there's a public swimming pool, and they still had lights on. So I decided to leave the sidewalk because usually people are just on their way home themselves and will just keep walking. Not in this case, though. As I reached the entrance with all the lights and turned around, this guy is literally 3 steps behind me. I told him that he shouldn't be following me and that I'd like for him to please keep going on, and I got no response. I then told him I don't like being followed and to please move on. He just smiled a creepy smile and, out of nowhere, grabbed my hair on the back of my head and pulled me towards him harder than I thought possible for his size. I fell on top of him, and he got knocked out when he hit the pavement. Idiot. I ran across the parking lot to the road at a safe distance where I called 112 while I could still keep an eye on him. He attempted to get up a few times when I decided to run, but I saw the lights from the ambulance come down the road, so I stayed, and one of them came to check up on me while we waited for the police to arrive. I'm fine. I've got a sore scale and a bruise on my left arm where I landed on him, and I'm sure he's got the biggest headache ever. Karma is a B*********, and here I thought I'd run out of dumb luck a long time ago. For context, I typically go shopping at around 7 or 8 p.m. nowadays since the store is less crowded around then. However, I try not to go unless I have to because number 1, the pandemic, and number 2, being out after sundown doesn't feel comfortable for my safety. Despite this, the area I live in is what I would consider to be safe. So going for a quick grocery run a little later in the evening has felt okay lately. So about 2 weeks ago, I was at my usual grocery store at around 7 p.m. I read somewhere online that you should make your trips to the store 30 minutes or less, and being the Gemini that I am, I knew I would have to make a list on my phone to follow or I would dawdle. I began my trip in the produce section, essentially only looking up from my phone to step out of people's way or to grab whatever was on my list. There were more people in the store than there usually were in the evenings when I go, so I had to make a few laps to wait for folks to clear certain areas that I needed to get to. I first realized I needed to do this when I was at the carrot section, but since it was too crowded, I figured I'd circle back in a minute or two and grab something on the other side of the section. In the meantime, trying to determine where to go, I looked up from my phone and began walking towards the bananas. On my way to get to them, I just kind of looked forward blankly, not really thinking of anything besides my task at hand. This was short-lived because a man in a gray zip-up hoodie and a baseball hat caught my eye as we walked past one another. Nothing really stood out about him besides the fact that he was looking at me and that he was walking really fast. I didn't think anything of it and kept heading towards the bananas. As I gathered my produce and a few things along the way back to the carrots, I passed the same man again. He made eye contact with me again. Normally, I'm not one to really make eye contact with other patrons. I'm a mind-my-own-business kind of person. But his demeanor just caught my eye. I also noticed that he was the only person in the section not carrying anything. It had to have been at least 3 minutes since we first passed one another. So to think that he was just kind of perusing around and not getting anything was strange. It's not like he just got there either. As I finally got the carrots, I made my way over to the bakery section, and the man passed me once again. This time, I didn't make eye contact, but I turned around to see where he was going. This sounds silly, but the way he was moving around the store didn't make sense. I was working my way from the front to back, and he was walking erratically in all different directions. Might I remind you, he still had nothing with him. As I began to turn my head to see what this man is doing, another guy runs past me wearing all black. Okay, strange. But he ran so close to me that the hair that was in front of my left shoulder was blown behind my back from the gust of air he blew past me. Since I was already turning, my hat fixated to see where this man is going. He had run over to the man that was passing by me frequently, and they were both looking right at me and talking to one another. They were about 30 feet away from me, so I couldn't make out what they were saying. I also looked for maybe a second because it was at this point that I started to get pretty anxious. I'd like to mention that I have generalized anxiety disorder, so when I'm in suspicious situations that might flare up anxiety, I really try to talk myself down from anything that might be illogical. I mean, who would follow me in a grocery store? I wasn't sure what to make of what I was seeing, and in an attempt to soothe my anxious thoughts, I decided to continue shopping and tried not to fixate on the two men. I looked back down at my phone and realized I forgot to grab lemons from the produce section, so I was irritated that I had to go back. I began walking head down when a woman taps my shoulder. I'm already feeling a myriad of emotions at this point, and to be touched by a stranger during a pandemic, I was really annoyed. I looked back up behind me to see who could have possibly been clumsy enough to knock into a stranger. When my eyes locked with the woman's who bumped me, now this is kind of difficult to explain, but stay with me. It's a pretty popular thing among women to communicate solely through eye contact and body language. Now, I know that all people of all genders do this, but for women specifically, it's different. I've been out with friends that have told myself, save me from this creek, without saying a single word. So despite the masks and distance between us, something in me told me to listen to her. She rolled her eyes downwards towards the floor, as if a ball were rolling past her feet in the exact direction the men that were looking at me and lapping me. She didn't look directly at them, but I knew she was indicating she was about to say something about them. She looked back up at me and in a whisper told me, heads up. My stomach sang. I knew I wasn't just paranoid. Someone else had noticed that something weird was going on. I walked past her to the right and nodded to indicate that I understood what she meant. It was at this point that I needed to get out of the store without looking panicked or raising suspicions. When I told my boyfriend this story, he questioned why I didn't just leave right then and there. First off, I had a basket full of produce that I needed to pay for. Second, I didn't want to raise suspicions or alert these men as to why someone they're following is suddenly making a run for it. So I swiftly began to navigate the aisles to gather a few more things on my list. As I moved through the store and looked down the aisles to see what items were where, one of the men was in each aisle, walking towards me. Every aisle I went down, one of them was there. I was terrified. I decided it was time to go. I went to self-checkout and hauled ass. I did my best to appear calm, but I know I looked frantic. Since it was dark outside, I did not feel comfortable walking to the car by myself once I was done. I approached 3 employees chatting amongst one another. I luckily got the attention of a female store manager and thought on my feet. I told her that my ex-boyfriend was in the store following me and I needed to be walked out. In hindsight, I probably should have alerted them to what was actually going on, but I wanted to get out of there, no questions asked, and she didn't ask questions. She said, "Oh, okay. I'm getting security to walk you out to your car." And as the guard appeared from the back of the line waiting to use the self-checkout, so did the 2 men. They made eye contact and broke left and right. When I tell you I almost pissed myself, my God, my heart was in my throat. Unluckily, I didn't see the man outside. The last I saw them was by the self-checkout. The security guard so kindly walked me to my car and made sure I drove away, which I am so grateful for. I called my boyfriend sobbing since my anxiety was so high at this point, and he advised me to take a different route home and make 4 right turns if I thought anyone was following me. For precaution, I stayed at a friend's house that night because I was so anxious. I'm so grateful nothing happened to me and that I'm here, but I cannot thank the woman who warned me in the store enough for validating my suspicions. If you witness anything that looks sketchy or weird, please tell or warn someone. I haven't heard about any kidnappings or crimes towards women in my area recently, thank God. It just scares me to think what could have possibly happened and what kind of people are out there. I think it goes without saying that I'm no longer going shopping after sundown, nor at that store. I'm blanking on where I heard this, but I think it really applies to how I felt that night. It's better to be safe than sorry and to be paranoid than dead. So, this happened about 4 years ago while I was still in high school. For a bit of background, my mom lives in an apartment in the city I went to high school in, and since she didn't live too far from the school, I went and returned home by foot every day. The story happened during winter, so when I got out of school at 5 p.m., it was already dark outside. I remember perfectly when it happened. It was Friday evening, and for once, I didn't have classes on Saturday. So, I took the time I had to go shopping with a friend. We finished around 6 p.m. and separated to go back to our homes. It was maybe 6:30 when I got onto the street where I lived, and I had 2 options, enter the building by the front door or by the back door, which was closer to where I was. So, I chose the second option and entered the alley where the gate was and started to look for my keys. But as I opened my bag, I saw the shadow on the wall next to me indicating someone was right behind me. Here's the thing, only residents of the building would go into this alley since there was nothing except the building's parking lot, closed off by the gate. So, clearly, the person had absolutely no reason to be here. I turned around to face a man, probably in his mid-30s. I tend to panic really quickly, so I tried to stay calm. He said something to me, but since I had my earphones in, I asked him to repeat what he said, thinking he was asking for directions or help. He simply replied that all was going as planned and that he just wanted to know my name. I didn't want to give him my name, so I gave him a fake one in the hope that he would leave me alone. But he asked if we could talk a bit and if I could give him my Snapchat ID because he wanted to know me better. I was really scared, but I decided to be polite since he could have been armed or something like that, and I didn't want to upset him. I told him I didn't have Snapchat, which was true, and he stopped smiling. He said, "Why are you lying? Every pretty girl your age has Snapchat. Otherwise, how else would you share your cute photos?" I didn't know how to react, so I simply said it was the truth and that I needed to get back home to take care of my little brother. At one point, he must have noticed how scared I was since he said to me, "Am I scaring you? Why are you scared? I just want to talk with you." And he actually started to yell in the street, saying that all girls were the same and that he hated women. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't speak. I was terrified. So, I started to slowly walk towards the gate, but he screamed and told me not to move or he'd rip my throat out. But then he calmed down and asked if I had a boyfriend. It was like speaking with two different people. I didn't want to reply, so he got mad again and walked towards me like he wanted to hit me. I wanted to run to the gate since it was like 10 meters away, but I knew he would follow me, and I needed to enter a code anyway, so he clearly would have hit me or worse. At this moment, a car drove into the alley. I didn't know the woman inside the car, but honestly, she was like my only escape. So, I screamed for help. She opened her window, told me to get in the car, and told the guy to move or she'll call the police. She waited with me until the creepy guy finally left and made sure I got home safely. I'll never thank her enough for saving me that day. The guy was creepy as hell, and to this day, I still think about what could have happened if the woman arrived a few seconds later. This happened years ago. I think I was about 16 years old back then. 16-year-olds could buy alcohol and cigarettes in the Netherlands where I am from. It was a Friday night, and I was on my way to a friend's house. I took a detour as I wanted to buy a few beers, snacks, and cigarettes at the local supermarket. As I walk into the supermarket, a man walks out. As we passed each other, he looks at me and says, "Wow." I think nothing of it, do the shopping, pay, and walk out. I looked towards some old clothing donation bins, and the same guy from before was standing behind one. He was sitting on his bike, looking at me. It was dark, the streets were deserted, and I still had a 10-minute cycle ahead of me. I got this bad feeling about it, so I unlocked my bike and started cycling. This is when that bad feeling proved to be justified, and as soon as I started cycling, that man started to as well. He catches up to me and converses with me. "Hi, where are you going?" he asked. "I'm gonna hang out at a friend's house," I replied. "Where does he live?" he continued. "Just a minute from here," I said. "Can I accompany you there?" he asked. "No thanks," I told him. As I said that, he grabs my bicycle handles and pulls me closer. I almost fall over, but I regain my balance and kick his bike. I start cycling as fast as I can, and he does as well, yelling at me. I arrived at my friend's house after what feels like an eternity. Unfortunately, my friend lives in a flat, so I have to ring the doorbell so he can buzz the door open. As I'm ringing the doorbell frantically, the man just stands a few meters behind me, waiting. I hear my friend asking who's there over the intercom. I scream and cry, telling him to let me in, and he does. Luckily, my friends are all very big, scary-looking guys. They heard the panic in my voice, and as they see me as their younger sister, came downstairs with chairs, ashtrays, and other makeshift weapons. Unfortunately, the guy had already left. I'm 8 years older now, but I'm still scared I will meet another person like that man. This happened a few years ago when I was still living with my mom, and I borrowed a car to go see my then boyfriend for the evening. It was around midnight when I got back to my neighborhood, so the roads were empty. That's when I noticed this dirty, run-down, rusted white utility van, and a maintenance guy would drive following me. I never saw the driver's face, but I got this immediate sinking feeling in my stomach because something felt wrong about this van. Now, I was only 20 at the time, but I knew better than to just drive straight to my house and let this person know exactly where I live. But I also wasn't 100% sure they weren't actually following me yet. I didn't want to jump to conclusions because it was late and I was alone and being paranoid. So, I drove to a shopping complex a few minutes out of the way that's well lit and has a public library to see if I was followed there. I thought I lost the van, but decided to wait in the parking lot for a few minutes because I had a bad feeling when I just couldn't shake. Sure enough, the van showed up and was driving in circles around the parking lot, looking for me. This scared me quite a bit, so I drove towards the big mall here that's always got security and police presence because it's the midway point between where I was and where I lived. I parked in a well-lit parking lot where I had a great view of the roads and the mall, but then I wasn't really easy to spot, and I waited to see if the van would show up and look for me. It did, and of course, this would be the one time security and the police were nowhere to be found, which was half the reason I decided to head there in the first place. Realizing whoever was driving this van was 100% actively following me in the middle of the night, I knew just driving home was not an option. And that's a terrifying realization. Luckily, the police station is just a few minutes away from where I was, so I try and discreetly drive away, hoping this van hasn't noticed me yet. I wasn't that lucky because it wasn't long before the van was back in my rearview mirror. At this point, I'm panicking pretty hard, and my anxiety is high. I finally pulled into the police station parking lot, and seconds later, the van came to a stop in the middle of the road for no more than a few seconds. I'm guessing just long enough for them to realize where I led them, and they took off immediately and so fast. I did make it home safe and without seeing the van again not long after, but this whole ordeal took up at least an hour of my night. It was after 1 a.m. by the time I made it home, and I was terrified the whole time. I don't know what this guy's specific intention was, but honestly, I don't need to know. I know it was nothing good, and I likely avoided a very bad situation. If you think someone is following you, it's not stupid or paranoid to make sure you aren't. Who knows what might have happened if I led them to my house or gotten out of the car. I was in this group on Facebook where people shared different kinds of stories, mostly funny stories. I usually post comments there using my dummy account, and most of the people there use dummy accounts as well. I had a fun conversation with this guy using a dummy account named Luffy who claimed to be 21 years old. We exchanged messages on Facebook without adding each other. We both found out that we live nearby each other, so we decided to meet up and have lunch in our mall near our school. I chose a place to meet where it was really crowded since I had a dress rehearsal for a play. He told me that he would wait for me in a burger stand near our school. The night before, we sent each other pictures. I was excited to meet him since he looked pretty fun to hang out with. By 4 p.m., I stood beside the burger stand. A heavily tinted red car stopped at the street in front of me, and I received a text message from him asking me to get into the red car. Since I've read a lot of stories on Let's Not Meet on Reddit, I decided to go with my instinct and send him a text saying I wouldn't get in the car unless he gets out and shows himself. What happened next made me promise myself that I would never meet anyone from the internet ever again. A man, most likely in his 30s, got out of the car and started to clutch me by my arm and kept tugging me. I screamed like I've never screamed before, making it noticeable since there are civilians there as well. The guy who watched over the burger stand came to us and asked what's wrong, clearly concerned. She's my daughter. She's in big trouble. She ran away from home, was this creep's defense. I denied it every time, and the burger guy told him that he would alert the guards from our school. That's when Luffy let go of my arm, got back inside his car, muttered to himself, and drove away. When the guards came, I told them everything, and I've never been let out of the school since that day without my guardian picking me up. I was catfished by a creepy, much older guy. I was 17 and in 11th grade. I usually don't accept random requests on my Instagram, especially if we had no mutuals. I took my page off private for a while, and so anyone could follow me. This is when I got a notification that Callum XP started following me. The page had a normal following, not small enough to question whether it was a fake account or not. He had multiple pictures of himself with friends and family with captions, and all his comments were off for all of his posts, which wasn't a red flag since I had mine off too. Immediately after following me, he went through my profile and liked all of my pictures. He was a fit, good-looking guy, so I was flattered. Not long after, he DM'd me, replying to a story of mine, asking me if I was from New York City and that he was from there too. We immediately hit it off and DM'd nonstop for a while. It didn't feel forced, and we never ran out of things to talk about. We eventually swapped phone numbers and started texting. He told me he was studying at a really good university, which was in a city 2 hours away from where we both lived. Our talks escalated to day-to-day phone calls which lasted for hours. I sincerely started growing feelings for him, and he made it clear he felt the same for me. We would talk about our deepest insecurities, our past, what we wanted our futures to look like, and that it had been about 2 months of talking, and I was undeniably eager to meet up in person. He would tell me he was coming to visit home on the weekend, but would always come up with an excuse as to why he couldn't make it. He gave very convincing and detailed excuses, never vague, so I didn't question it. I hadn't told any friends about him until my best friend and I had a sleepover. I ended up telling her about him, showed her his pictures, and didn't leave out that we hadn't met yet. Wanting to look out for me, she suggested I video chat him to make sure he is who he says he is before meeting up. She told me she didn't want me to freak out, but that she was sure she'd seen his picture on Tumblr before. There's a tool on Google that can be used to locate social media accounts and articles where the pictures have been posted. While she was on that, I called him and asked him if he was at home alone before asking him to video chat so he couldn't make up an excuse on the spot. He said he was home and alone but couldn't video chat because of his weak internet connection. My heart sank into my stomach. The possibility of being catfished was not far-fetched anymore. I quickly downloaded WhatsApp because I remembered him telling me he spoke to his parents on it. Before doing that, though, my friend showed me the results of what she found, which devastated me to my core. The man in the pictures was a French model and singer. We found the exact pictures that the piece have used on his catfish profile on an actual verified Instagram account. My devastation turned into anger, then turned into absolute disgust and revulsion when I saw his profile picture on WhatsApp. He was evidently much older than he claimed he was, probably in his 30s, who lied about being a university student and some other things he told me in detail about being part Italian and part Colombian. He even made up an excuse as to why he didn't speak Italian or Spanish when he claimed he frequently visited back home. I wanted to crawl into a hole and die. I started to sob uncontrollably and confronted him on WhatsApp. He went on to explain how he came across my profile and wanted desperately to get to know me. He said he knew I wouldn't be interested in who he actually is and that I wouldn't be attracted to him. So instead, he used his fake account, which he was already using and active on prior to coming across my profile. He said he came close to coming clean multiple times, but he was afraid of how I would react. He said even though his persona was fake, everything else was genuine. It turns out he was a 31-year-old mechanic, and he was living with his parents. He even confessed to driving to my neighborhood, finding my high school, and following me around as I went about my day. I blocked him off WhatsApp, then he quickly started texting my number, begging me not to block that too and to give him a chance to explain things face to face. Hell no. I went on to block him off of everything, feeling absolutely heartbroken and betrayed while doing so. I spent months of my life daydreaming and fantasizing about how it would be like when we finally met in person and where it would go from there. I grew genuine feelings for him and even considered applying for the same university he was supposedly studying at. I got over it eventually, but I've definitely grown to be very paranoid and distrusting when it comes to meeting people online. I'm happily married now, but I wonder what would have happened if he and I met in person and the consequences I would have faced for being so naive and oblivious.